chapter 4 tonight, as you can see from your handout. Already studied one dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had in this book, and tonight we're going to look at a second one, of course, where Daniel once again becomes another key figure in helping him understand that dream, and of course in him understanding why it happened and the fulfillment of it. We're going to start with question number 1, though, on your handout here, and we kind of have a discussion or open-it question. It's mainly just to get everybody awake. That's why I do this, make you think a little bit whenever we first start. And I know Wednesday nights are sometimes difficult throughout the middle of the week, but hopefully it'll help us a little bit. What does the term temporary insanity mean to you? Okay. That could be. I'm finding that out as I get older and older. What else? Are there any other meanings? Yeah, and when I think of the term, usually in our society it deals with the legal system, doesn't it? And I guess those people who would deal in criminal law defense would probably know it much better than we would. But it's basically when a person is accused of a serious crime, and they're looking for a defense to try to explain away, the reason why a person did something so extreme. One of the arguments that is used is temporary insanity. And basically it's based upon, maybe that person's got a psychiatric condition or maybe some kind of mental illness. And the idea is that, in the heat of the moment, they lose all reason of what is right and what is wrong. So they don't have the ability to understand what they're doing. They don't have the ability to understand the consequences that come along with their actions and their words. And so I think in our society, that's probably the general idea or main idea or main definition that we would assign to it. But as you read about this story here concerning Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4, you think that would be a good term to apply to him? That was a question, by the way. Evidently, the wake-up question didn't work, Lanny. Yeah. Basically, it is, isn't it? I mean, he basically lived like a wild animal for the space of probably a reference, I think it is, probably at least to 7 years, the time period there that it was long enough that his hair grew out and his nails grew out to, where people could look at him and say that's just not normal. But he basically lived like an animal. I mean, he lived out in the wide open fields. He ate grass. He slept there at night. It's been a while back, but I did quite a bit of study on it. I think, isn't there some kind of medical condition that bears some resemblance to that? Does anybody know? Any of our doctors or vets or anybody? No? Okay. Well, I'm not going to bore you tonight with that explanation. All I know is it happened, and I know that it was from God. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that issue itself, but rather I think the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned from it is what's important and what we can learn from it too. So let's start here in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 4, talk a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. So once again, God used a dream to communicate with Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he did that back in chapter 2, the dream of the great statue. And do you remember the mindset of Nebuchadnezzar after the first dream that he had? Remember some of the emotions that he experienced? Yeah, he was really anxious, wasn't he? He was really troubled about this this dream, and remember whenever we studied it, we kind of mentioned, I think in the original language, it's more the idea of he dreamt the same dream over and over again every night. But it did make him troubled in his mind. But when you read about this dream, he is troubled about it, but there's also another emotion that's mentioned there that he experiences. Did anybody catch that as you were looking through chapter 4 here? Yeah. So the first one, he was a little bit troubled. He was a little bit anxious. And this one, he was troubled about it too, but he was also afraid. Some versions translate it, he was terrified. He was scared. And why do you think Nebuchadnezzar would be frightened by this dream? Compared to at least the first one that he had. Yeah, and I think when you think about the nature, we'll of course talk a little bit about, I don't know how specific we'll get about the dream itself, but some of the generalities that occur in the dream itself. I think one of the things that made him afraid was in this dream, you have this giant flourishing tree, and what happens to the tree? Yeah, gets cut down to a stump, stripped of all its leaves and its branches and its fruit. And I think probably Nebuchadnezzar had a thought, at least in his mind, this is about me. And if you're the tree and the tree gets cut down, that's probably not a good thing, right? And remember that Daniel had already told them, your empire is not going to last forever, right? So he knew that the days of that kingdom were indeed limited. And so I think whenever he experiences this dream, he's probably thinking back to this first one that Daniel explained and thinking, well, maybe it has to do with the timing of this particular empire kingdom, coming to an end. But who does he turn to first to try to find out the interpretation of this dream? Yeah, once again, he calls all the wise men and all the magicians, all the sorcerers, anybody who supposedly has any kind of connection with any of the deities, anybody who would have been considered at least, I guess, maybe above average. Would that be the right term when it came to wisdom and understanding? But why do you think he turns to them? Maybe he was looking for a good explanation, you think? Or a good interpretation? I don't know. Nebuchadnezzar, he's kind of an interesting character whenever you study him here in the Bible, but he certainly had his moments where it looks like he believed in God and acknowledged him, and to what extent he ever followed him, I don't know for sure, because the Bible just doesn't give us that information. But why would you call for your advisors and all these people? Because when he called for them the first time, what happened? Remember the first dream? Yeah, they didn't know, right? They couldn't tell him the dream. They couldn't tell him the interpretation. So what happens the second time when he calls them? Yeah, these guys are pretty worthless, aren't they? They're just baffled. When Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't do like he did them in the first dream, where he said, you tell me the dream and then I know you know the interpretation. He actually tells them the dream, but they didn't really understand it. They were baffled. What could this mean? And you had some pretty weird things. I'm not a dream analyst by any means, but you think about this giant flourishing tree, and then it's cut down, and then this band of iron and bronze is put around the stump, and then you hear about this man that's going to live like a beast. So there was some weird things. Sometimes those weird dreams can kind of confuse you, can't they? And so I think these guys as far as fully, trying to assign a meaning to it, they were just at a total loss as to what it could be. So who does Daniel call for? Or who does Daniel call for? Well, I just gave you the answer, didn't I? Who did Nebuchadnezzar call for? He calls for Daniel. And why did Nebuchadnezzar, all these other guys couldn't help him, right? So why did the king think that Daniel could help him? Yeah, he helped him before. And remember what Daniel had told him whenever this dream and this interpretation was revealed to him. Daniel told him, how did Daniel tell him he came to know the dream and to be able to interpret it? Through God, right? Daniel was very careful to emphasize that to Nebuchadnezzar whenever he talked to him. He said, I know this dream and the interpretation of it, not because I'm smarter than everybody else, not because I have some ability that everybody else had, but because the God of heaven revealed it to me. And so I think in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he says a phrase over and over again concerning Daniel and his relationship to deity. Did you notice that? Several times you'll find it here in this chapter. How does he describe Daniel? Yeah, a man with the spirit of the Holy God in him. And so he believed that the God of the heavens was in touch, that Daniel communicated with the God of the heavens. He was in touch with his spirit. And so he believed that once again, Daniel could come to him and help him. But, I sit here and I ask the question, why would he ever ask for anybody but Daniel after Daniel chapter 2? Why would he ever even try these guys again? So question number 4 here, what were the visions that the king related to Daniel? Yeah, and so, Nebuchadnezzar just basically tells Daniel what he saw in that vision, and of course, the first thing that he sees is a tree, right? And what is this, like an ordinary tree, an everyday tree that you'd see? Yeah, it was gargantuan, wasn't it? It was probably the biggest tree that Nebuchadnezzar had ever seen in his dreams or in person. But it was a massive tree, and this tree had tons of branches, didn't it? Had tons of leaves on it, had tons of fruit. And who was living under the tree? Okay, bunch of animals. Is that all? Yeah. So you basically have, this idea of all of creation is living under this tree and, being fed from the fruit that's dropping from this tree. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he sees this massive tree. I think the word all is used several times there in verses 11 and 12. But all flesh, all manner. What is all does it say here? It could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely. Its fruit abundant. In it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heaven dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So he sees this massive tree. What happens to the tree? Well, he hears a voice, right? What does the voice say? Yeah, chop it down. Cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, pluck off all of its fruit, and then, of course, he says leave the stump and the roots though in the ground, and then bind it with a band of iron and a band of bronze, and then let it be wet with the dew of the heaven. Let it live with a wild beast until 7 times Passover. So again, this dream, it's one of those dreams. If you dreamt it, you'd probably be scratching your head, saying, "What in the world was that all about?" Right? But there were certainly some weirder details in it, things they're out of the normal. So Daniel goes to interpret this dream after Nebuchadnezzar tells it to him, and before he does that, though, question number 6 here: how does Daniel react whenever the king tells him this dream? Yeah, Daniel was stunned, and he was troubled so much that the king could see it when he looked at him, couldn't he? And so, why would Daniel be troubled and stunned by this dream? Because it's not about him, right? Yeah, that'd be a hard thing to tell one of those Eastern monarchs, wouldn't it? And especially when you think about, the nature of the lifestyle that they had basically created for themselves. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later if we have time. But the king, when Daniel heard the dream and understood the interpretation of it, he was troubled, and he was stunned at what was going to happen, I think, also to Nebuchadnezzar too. But one of the things that he does is he kind of tactfully prepares the king for the interpretation of the dream. How does he prepare the king? Yeah, he said, "Let's hope this dream's about your adversaries or your enemies instead of about you." Right? Let's pray that's the case. But he said, basically what he's saying is this: I wish what was going to happen to you would happen to your enemies instead. And so that was kind of a compliment, in and of itself to the king there. But he was certainly concerned about it. Do you ever get the impression too, as you read through the book of Daniel, that Daniel had a personal concern for these rulers? I think he did. I think he was a really good-hearted individual. Even though these weren't the greatest people on earth, one of the things that Daniel did get the privilege of is he did get the privilege of introducing them to Jehovah God and having interaction with them. And so, of course, Daniel does that back in Daniel chapter 2. I imagine he was hopeful, that Nebuchadnezzar would come to his senses and, end up being a follower of God too. But you do get the impression, or at least I do, that he did have some personal concern for Nebuchadnezzar himself. So question number 7 here: what did the tree symbolize in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? Yeah, Daniel announced, the tree is you, O king, right? So that's pretty easy to understand there. And, it goes back to a principle. We talked about it when we started the book of Daniel. Why was Nebuchadnezzar where he was? How did he get to be this powerful and, be ruler over all these places and empires and conquer Israel? God, right? God raised him up. God appointed him to carry out his punishment against these nations, against his own people. And so God had put him into this position, and with the help of Jehovah and by his decree, Nebuchadnezzar had built this vast empire. And of course, that vast empire sheltered many different nations, many different people, right? We talked a little bit about it, I think, in Daniel chapter 2, the vastness of the empires, and kind of looked at their geographical outline. But this was a large empire. A lot of different people, a lot of different nations were taken care of under the Babylonian Empire. But he ruled a great kingdom, and that was symbolic of that gigantic tree. It was a strong kingdom. It was a kingdom whose dominion reached to the ends of the earth. But the king, what was the problem with Nebuchadnezzar? What would you say his main sin was? He probably had a lot of them, but what was kind of the main one in this chapter? Pride. That's exactly right. He wanted to take credit for what God had done, right? And so in his mind, he was so powerful and he ruled all these nations because of him, right? I did this. Do we ever do things like that? I think we do, don't we? I think pride is one of those sins that in human beings it's hard to understand and overcome. But one of the main principles that is laid down in this chapter and really throughout the book of Daniel, God's the one in control. That God's the one pulling the strings and making things happen, and he's just using us, to accomplish his will. And so don't try to take credit for something that God does. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He was full of all this pride. So the cutting down of the tree symbolized Nebuchadnezzar's humbling and removal from the throne. And what was the leaving of the stump? Yeah, he wasn't totally done for, was he? Tree was going to be cut down for a while, but the stump was going to be held there in bands and iron until God released it. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar's empire. Well, we might if we have enough time, but what happened to his empire after his sanity was restored to him. And then you have the idea of the 7 times. Again, I think it's probably 7 years. Some people might not agree with that, but for 7 years he would live like a beast. He would eat grass. He would feel the forces of nature on his body. It's kind of interesting. We're in chapter 4 here, but if you'll turn over just one chapter, whenever we read about Belshazzar and Daniel's kind of explaining some of his interactions that he had with his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar, but he makes a statement in chapter 5 and about verse 21. Notice how it's described here. It says, "Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses." So when it talks about him living like a beast there, that's not prophetic language. That's literal, isn't it? I mean, he literally ate grass. He literally lived outside, slept under the sun and the moon and the stars, and he would wake up in the morning wet with dew all over. And that was part of his punishment till he learned and he understood. He wasn't the one pulling the strings. He wasn't the one in control, but Jehovah God was. So here's kind of interesting thing too. Number 8, when Daniel explains the meaning of this dream, gives the interpretation to the king, and basically says the judgment of God's getting ready to come upon you. What did he advise Nebuchadnezzar to do? Yeah. Daniel concludes his interpretation with a plea for obedience, doesn't he? And I want you to stop and to think about this, because what Daniel did was not par for the course, right? This wasn't something that a person usually did to the king. You don't walk up there and say, change your ways. Okay? You've been living wickedly. You need to stop living wickedly. You need to start doing what's right. And you need to quit being proud. You need to humble yourself. And you need to care for the poor. You need to do all these things that Daniel talks about there. But he urged the king to turn from his sins, to humble himself for God, and humble himself before God. And there's a great lesson for us, I think, in this, because sometimes when we study and we talk about the future and what God is going to do in the future, and that's basically what Daniel's talking about here, it brings up a plea for the present, doesn't it? Makes us mindful of, if that's what God is going to do in the future, then what is our responsibility in the present? And that's basically what Daniel was trying to tell Nebuchadnezzar here. If we correctly understand the future and what God will do in it, then we're, as hearers, we're going to have a responsibility to act upon that. And that's what Daniel was hoping Nebuchadnezzar would do. Now, again, was this a safe thing that Daniel did? No. That's exactly right. Yeah. So did Daniel know that Nebuchadnezzar had supreme authority, that he was basically the author of life and death? Did he know that? Yeah. Did he know this guy had a violent temper? Remember, we've talked about his temper before. You say the wrong thing to the king, or you do the wrong thing, and man, he was a lunatic. I mean, he was crazy. But despite all that, Daniel knew that it was his responsibility to warn him, wasn't it? And that's kind of like us today. You know, sometimes we let fear keep us from telling people what God wants them to do. But Daniel didn't hold back, even though he knew there might be consequences that awaited him. I was kind of thinking through the Bible, and another one of those examples that came to mind was John the Baptist. Or when John the Baptist confronts Herod over his relationship with Herodias, what did he tell him? He said, just stay there, you're doing fine, right? He said, you need to break it off, because what you're doing is not right, and it's against the law of God. It's not right in his sight. What happened to him because of it? Wound up getting his head chopped off eventually, didn't he? But it was a dangerous thing. He was put into prison because of it. Later on, through a little bit of deceit, he was put to death because of it. But it brings up this idea, and Dennis mentioned it here. Eastern kings, and we're not necessarily talking about the Jewish kings, but those east of Israel, they basically like to live in blissful isolation and only hear good news. I mean, that was their lifestyle. And so if you did something to disrupt that, you were in danger of facing the fury of the king. But Daniel told him what he needed to hear. Okay, so we read about Nebuchadnezzar. Question number 9 here. What was the king's attitude after just 1 year? Let me ask you this before we answer this. Do you think Nebuchadnezzar believed Daniel when he gave him the interpretation of the dream? Yeah. Do you believe that what's a good way to put it? Do you believe that he thought Daniel spoke the truth? So here's the question. Why didn't he change? Yeah. There's one of the things that's not real clear in the dream itself is the timing of this event, right? When's it going to happen? Well, maybe he did change for a day. You know, maybe he did change for a week. Maybe he did change for a month, and then he thought, well, it didn't happen. You know, so maybe I'm safe. But it's actually a year later whenever this dream comes to fruition. Go ahead. Yeah, and I think too that he's probably at a time in his kingdom where everything's going great. You know, it's still growing, it's still expanding, and maybe he thinks, well, I'm in the clear now. But like you said, I think that's all of us. I mean, do we know who God is? Do we know what he wants from us? Do we always do it? Why not? We're proud people, aren't we? Go ahead. I think that was probably, he's referring there to Ecclesiastes 8:11, but it's a principle of man that, if we do something bad and we're not immediately punished for it, we think, well, we got away with it, right? And what does that encourage us to do? Do it again, right? We got away with it once, maybe we can get away with it again. And so maybe that was the mindset. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar here, his pride was entrenched in his heart. And so he's walking in pride 1 year later whenever he starts speaking these words to himself. And what do we know about the sin of pride and as far as how God feels about it? Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those sins, Proverbs 6:16 and following, 6 things the Lord hates, 7 are abomination to him. First one is a proud look. There are, sin is sin, but there's certain sins that God looks at and maybe I should say infuriates him a little bit more than others. They're all punishable by him, but pride is one of those, isn't it? It's one of those that God especially hates within mankind. Part of it is because he knows what it does to us, and not going to make us right with him. But Nebuchadnezzar was walking in pride, and that's, again, one of those sins that God hates. So question number 10 here, when does the voice speak from heaven? Right, a voice, Nebuchadnezzar's out here, and he's probably, I don't know where he is specifically, but he's probably looking out over his kingdom and, thinking about all the things that he's accomplished. And he says, look at me. Look what I've been able to do by my great power and my great might and my wisdom. And when does the voice speak from heaven? Yeah, while the words were still in his mouth. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he's in his egotistical meditation here. And right as these words are coming to his mouth, the voice speaks to him from heaven. And basically that voice says, it's time. The time of your probation has ended. The judgment of God has arrived. And one of the things that we learn when we study the Bible is, when it's time for the judgment of God, is God going to put that off? Is he going to delay? No. Lord isn't slack concerning his promises, is he? Like we count some men that say, well, maybe he'll do it, maybe he won't. When it comes time for the judgment of God, God's going to bring that judgment. And, it's a great lesson for us because all of us, we're not going to literally hear the voice, but in a sense we are. Time's up, get ready for judgment. Probation's over, right? And that's what Nebuchadnezzar heard. So, how quickly, question 11 here, did the things go south for Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah, the words were still on his lips whenever things began to change. Right, his heart immediately became like that of an animal. He left the royal palace, went out into the fields to live with wild animals. And basically, I think what God was saying here is, since you're going to act like a beast, you're a beast at heart, you're going to live like one. And he allowed that brutish nature of Nebuchadnezzar to come to full fruition. But think about this. Could God just have destroyed him right there on the spot for his arrogance and pride? Nobody ever questioned it. Yeah. So why did he spare him? Yeah, there was still a great lesson that God was going to teach all the Gentiles through this king. So you read about Nebuchadnezzar, kind of interesting thing there, question 12, what can no man say to God? Nebuchadnezzar figures out a little bit about God, doesn't he? About Jehovah God. What can no one say to him? Yeah. Listen, God is in control of everyone and everything, and he can do whatever he pleases. And nobody has the right to question him. Right? Why? Who do we belong to? Who does the earth creation belong to? It's his. He can do whatever he wants with it. And so as human beings, we don't have the authority to say, hey, why are you doing this? Or why are you doing that? And that's one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar learned from it. But he did learn a great lesson, didn't he? And that was that God is in control. And the only reason he was where he was is because God put him there and allowed him to be. And there's some interesting things that happen because of that. Read the first 3 verses of this chapter. It's a unique chapter because it's an official autobiography written by the king himself. And he publishes it throughout all of his empire. And think about what he says about himself. I did what was wrong. I was a man full of pride. God humbled me. And I am where I am because of the God of the Israelites. So think about the great witness that he was able to bear to all the Gentile nations because of what God did through this particular act. All right, we're out of time. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, questions before we end?